Welcome back. This is the Joint Justice Oversight Committee, and we are continuing our work for this afternoon. And we are talking about sheriff transports. And there was a report that was done by the auditors, state auditor's office, and we have, there you go, he disappeared. We had Tim Ash, who's now the deputy state auditor, on, and he disappeared. And we have Linda Lambert on as well from the auditor's office. So I'm not sure who is going to be testifying. If it's
Peggy says he's coming in.
back.
He's coming back now.
So we have Tim Ash and Linda Lambert. So I'll leave it up to you two to begin. Oops, we lost it. There he is.
There he is.
Okay. I think the best place to start is with the auditor's office and the report. So Tim and Linda, I'm handing it over to you two. And I'm assuming that the deputy, that Tim would go first, I would assume. If the deputy state auditor. You're welcome.
Representative Emmons, you've proven yourself wise yet again. I will kick off. For the record, Tim Ash in my role as Deputy State Auditor. Hello, everybody. I think I served on Justice Oversight for 6 years. And
You did.
So listening to some of the discussion this morning, it was resurrecting old feelings. I'm going to be fairly brief and kind of do a quick walkthrough of the report we produced, why we produced it, and then if there are any more technical questions, I'll turn it over to Linda Lambert from our office, who's our Director of IT and Performance Audits and one of our senior most auditors to get into the weeds if you have questions. I just begin by saying,
and the report is on our webpage for those folks who are watching us and can access it electronically.
yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I'll just briefly say the reason the initiative for this report stems actually from the big bill in 2020 that was passed in late September. There was a provision which was very brief, but asked the auditor's office to look into, quote unquote, whether any sheriff department inappropriately received funding from more than one source, effectively trying to make sure that there wasn't any transport deputy activity that was being paid twice for the same hour worked. That work was conducted by McSorley McCoy, which is a professional accounting firm based out of South Burlington that regularly works on behalf of the auditor's office with the sheriffs as part of the annual sheriff auditing process. And they're the ones whose name actually appears on the audit report itself. As the chair just mentioned, if you are less familiar with the use of transport deputies, there's also a memo from Auditor Hoffer in today's documents section, which has a useful short history of the nature of these particular positions, which might be a good primer if you're less familiar. The audit report itself is also there, and I'm going to attempt to do a screen share to pull that up. Let me do this now. And all right, so Chair Emmons, can you see what I'm looking at, which is the actual report?
Yes, we can.
Great, I'll call that a success for the moment. So the audit effectively asked 6 questions to get at that key question of whether any office was inappropriately receiving funding from more than one source. And I'll be brief with each of the 6 questions that appear in the report. And as I said, we're happy to answer questions. The first asks, of the 5 departments that were looked into by McSorley, what was the gross pay, both from the state and from the department? In short, the state is the one that is the primary payer of the salary for these transport deputies. if the individual does additional work for the sheriff's department, that would show up on what's listed as department payroll. I swear that's not me.
Someone's
little
phone
break.
went off.
All right. My cat might be scratching in the background.
It's still on.
You tell me if you're ready.
Sorry, Tim.
Look, it's not the worst thing that's happened to me in a legislative committee room. The
Or us here.
second question looks at basically how many hours were billed against the various COVID codes. You'll see the 3 categories here and the grand totals for the 5 departments. These were the specific COVID codes that related to effectively someone not actually being on the job performing duties for COVID related reasons. I'll just briefly explain the first column, which says C19 paid not work. That was the initial code that was used by the Department of Human Resources from the period of when basically COVID started till April 5th. At that point, there were more specific reasons that someone would code based on COVID, and that's really what you see in those second 2 columns: COVID not work, send home, and then COVID leave. In anticipation of a potential question, because we've received a few questions about this before, you'll notice fairly significant numbers of hours under the COVID not work, sent home column for Bennington and Chittenden. And those are quite significant numbers of work hours. We're not in a position to explain why some departments had people who were sent home to be paid, but had no other duties that were identified that might be appropriate, whereas other departments did. That would be a question, I think, best directed to the sheriff's departments themselves. But as you can see, a considerable number of hours were paid out for those who were at home, but not because they were at home because they were sick or quarantining for family reasons or others. The third question relates to the number of transports that actually occurred in the period ending in March 20 compared to the next year. So basically, what was the COVID effect in terms of the number of transports? You'll see that for all 5 departments, it was way down, ranging from about 1/5 as many to as little as about 1/10 as many in both Chittenden and Orleans. Question 4 says basically, what were some of the other things that transport deputies might have done? I won't read through here other than to say things like other law enforcement work, court security, patrol hours, and some state grants like DUI prevention fall into that category. I should highlight the last sentence here on this page speaks to one of the recommendations that comes out of this brief audit report, which is a recommendation that there be more consistent and detailed accounting for the use of transport deputy time. That's something that is recommended that the Department of State's Attorney and Sheriffs work with HR as well as the local sheriffs to make sure that there's more specific accounting for the use of time. There's a table that kind of breaks out the level of specificity and room for improvement at the 5 departments. I'll let you take a look at that. Questions 5 or 6 and 6 get a little bit more to the heart of the question that was in the legislation itself and ask about whether there was overlap. I will summarize what's here and say that effectively there were 33 instances where individuals were receiving regular state pay plus COVID pay on the same day. However, in 32 of those instances, the records appeared clear enough that the use of the word overlap is merely to say that both types of billing were happening on the same day, but that the grand totaled to 8 hours. There was one instance in Franklin County where it was not clear when some of the hours worked, and so the auditors could not make a determination in that instance. And in the last question, did the state pay the sheriff department for work performed under state contracts that was conducted by transport deputies? Again, effectively the same finding, that in all but the instance that you see here, in almost all of the instances, the overlap really represents 2 types of billing on the same day, but for a grand total of 8 hours. However, there was noticeable room for improvement by the auditors. That has been communicated to the department and also to the sheriff's offices, that we see room for improvement here in terms of the hourly billing and accounting for what was occurring during those times. And would mention that helpfully in that regard, and I want to thank Sheriff Anderson and Annie Noonan from the department. At or around the time this was released, partly at their request, we held a training with McSully McCoy with all of the sheriff's offices in the state to talk about general accounting practices, and discussed this report in some detail, and anticipate that they'll be working together to make sure that the recommendation is followed through. So I'm going to wrap there, and happy to field any questions or have Linda answer any of the technical ones, but that is effectively the sum total of the report.
Well, thank you for this. I will open it up for questions, comments.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Senator.
I know there were whistleblower complaints about 2 departments, Bennington and Franklin, and double dipping, where the evidently the transport deputy was paid state transport, doing other duties where the department was also paid. Was that confirmed or not confirmed, or were those 2 whistleblower complaints dismissed? No? Or can you tell us, actually?
I'm going to hand that off to Linda, largely because of her professional diligence. She'll answer with a precision that I might not be as adept at.
So I would say that based on the responses to questions 5 and 6 that McSully found, that those were not substantiated, at least not during the time frame that was looked at. So if it had been happening in the past, we wouldn't have seen that in this engagement. I will say, however, that Franklin was one of the sheriff departments where there were some issues with the documentation. Specifically, I believe that they didn't necessarily have in their system the specific hours that were worked. So it wasn't as clear in that case about whether or not there would be insight about whether what you mentioned, Senator Sears, was happening.
Thank you. But I still, there have been a number of allegations about double dipping. Not even with state paid deputies, but for example, contract towns being charged for the same sheriff at different locations. So in other words, one town was paying for the sheriff and the other town was paying for the sheriff at the same time, same hours. And I'm hopeful that some of these recommendations that you just outlined will help prevent that from occurring. And when it's the chief law enforcement officer in the county, one would hope that they would make sure that everything is above.
Well, I can say I know that McSully McCoy will be following up as we work with the sheriff's departments on their accounting practices as a matter of normal course on this particular issue. So I'm hopeful that without regard to whether the allegations were accurate or not, we'll clean up the accounting for it so that people have more confidence moving forward.
So Tim, in your recommendations in your report, are there any recommendations that the legislature needs to get involved in, or is this more structural within the world of the sheriffs themselves and their departments?
I would say this falls into an administrative question of the departments of human resources, state's attorneys, and sheriff's office working together to make these improvements. I don't believe that legislation would be required at this time.
Questions? Thoughts? So let's move on. We do have Sheriff Roger Marcoux from Lamoille County on Zoom. And then we have Annie Noonan, who is with our state's attorneys, the Sheriff's Association, and we'll start with Sheriff Marcoux.
Good afternoon,
And
everybody.
one thing too, Sheriff, that we're finding, we're having a hard time hearing people who are on Zoom. So make sure you're close to your microphone and speak up.
Yes, ma'am. How can you hear me now?
That works.
Okay. I have thank you, everybody. And I apologize for not being there, but I'm testifying from Morristown here. I did submit written testimony, and that's the first time I've ever done that. And Annie Noonan sent that to the committee. I don't know if you want me to go and read through that, or if your time is better suited. I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to.
Could you give a summary of it at
Sure.
all?
Yes, sure. So first of all, even though I am a first vice president with the Vermont Sheriffs, I testified as the Lamoille County Sheriff, and in the way I saw things. Last winter, I had worked quite a bit with Senator Sears on some issues, and the way I structured my testimony was first getting into the section of the statutes in Title 24. It's 290A and B, which tells you all a little bit something about how a sheriff's department is the statutory language for the establishment of a sheriff's department. And in the B section tells a little bit about full-time deputies, sheriffs, whose primary responsibility is transportation of prisoners and persons with mental health conditions and psychiatric disabilities. Those are what's referred to as the state paid deputies. And the appointment of those folks, and this is important to remember, is given by each of the sheriffs in the 14 counties. But there is no other legislative language that really details to a real granular level as to what those state paid deputies can be used for and not. And I went on to explain that even though the state pays for the salary and the benefits of these state paid deputies, whose primary responsibility is the transportation of prisoners to court from correctional centers, the state does not pay for vehicles. So the sheriff has to basically derive income elsewhere to pay for the vehicles. And also that the 25 state paid deputy positions, which are four vacancies right now, those positions are not enough to transport all of the prisoners in this state. In an addendum, I've listed, and I'll go through it very quickly here, but in fiscal 17, the sheriffs transported 7,270 prisoners. In 18, 6,834. In 19, 6,784. In 20, 4,493. And at the time when I wrote this report, we had transported 671. And just so you have an idea as to what we're talking about in terms of these state paid deputies, Addison County has 1 assigned to it. Bennington County has 2. Caledonia County has 2. Chittenden has 6. Essex County has no positions. Franklin County has 2 positions. They're both vacant and they have been since sometime during COVID. Grand Isle has no positions. Lamoille has 1 position. The position is vacant. Orange has 1 position. Orleans has 2 positions, and one of those is vacant. Rutland, 2 positions. Washington, 2 positions. Wyndham, 2 positions, and Windsor, 2 positions for 25. And so that gives you an idea as to what we're talking about. Now, the sheriffs have to supplant these 25 deputies with other deputies that are paid by the state only through a per diem. And the per diem is for $22 an hour. And then on top of that, they'll pay for Social Security and Medicare, workers' compensation, and unemployment insurance, I believe. So, and that brings it up to $24.66. So on top of that, the sheriff still has to provide the car, the uniforms, the training, and there's no other way to derive, get that revenue without working these contract details. So, and just an idea of a vehicle these days is low side 35,000 up to 50,000 with another about $8,000 worth of equipment that has to be put in it. And the cost to outfit a deputy is right around $1,800 to $2,000 per deputy, regardless of level 2 or level 3. What was used to be referred to as part-time is level 2. Level 3 being that they go through 16 weeks at the academy. Currently, we are receiving 61 cents a mile. We always receive the federal mileage rate. The issue being that we can transport a prisoner to court and the car can sit idle for several hours, or it does sit idle for several hours most every day, because in most instances, our transportees are not seen immediately. And again, I've gone into more. I just want to make everybody aware that, and the best way I can do is by using an example. I did have a state paid deputy that was not busy at the beginning of the COVID declaration. My county was providing support to the state by providing security for motels in both Chittenden and Washington County. And we came up with an arrangement with the state's attorneys and sheriff's department, and maybe Annie Noonan will talk to this a little bit more, but where that person worked and we did not charge the state for 4 days a week. The 5th day a week, or any overtime or what have you, we charged the state, but that was to help pay for our vehicle and our costs that are not otherwise covered. So I think double dipping can be taken to extreme, but I would ask you to consider that we need to have a way to generate income to pay for these vehicles and equipment that the state does not pay for. Let me see. I talked about my belief that the state paid deputies should be involved with the transportation of juveniles for the Department of Children and Families, for the Department of Mental Health, and even on these motel security details. Without proper security, a lot of the owners of the motels would not sign on to help these folks out that needed a place to stay. So in my opinion, if a state paid deputy was otherwise not busy, and which was the case predominantly during the COVID emergency, then I think that there's some mechanism that could be found that where they should help the state with some of these other needs. So, and then basically, I'll get right to the crux. I mentioned that Lamoille Sheriff's Department did assist with security in Chittenden and Washington, and just so you have an idea as to the pressures put on our department with that is from March 20th till recently, we had worked over 12,000 hours in Chittenden County, and in Washington County over 3,000 hours. So there is quite a bit of need with various state agencies. So then I took the liberty to finish up. I took the liberty of recalling a lot of the conversations I had with Senator Sears, and just wanted to lay out some the options for the committee if they're going to do something, and the pros and cons of each one of those options from my perspective. The first one is status quo, stay as present, and the pros of that would be that the sheriffs have done a very, very good job through the years with prisoner transports, with only 1 or 2 attempted escapes and minimal use of force issues. The sheriffs have subsidized the transport program, providing cars and equipment, and also having the sheriff's cars sitting idle at court for long periods of time. That has saved the state a lot of money. Sheriffs deal with all the staffing, scheduling issues relating to court-ordered state transports, and many of the departments here, the majority of them do assist state agencies and departments with their needs. The cons of staying with the status quo is the state does not have control over the sheriffs or enough control over the state paid deputies when they are not engaged in court transports. When the state has a need, there's no statutory language compelling a state paid deputy to assist. There's no funding to assist the true costs of sheriffs of this program. Number 2 option, and these aren't in any particular order, but stay the same, status quo, but with legislative language detailing the manner in which the state and sheriff shall utilize these state paid deputies and fund the true costs of the program. Number 3, transfer all state paid deputies to a state agency or department. First agency, perhaps the state's attorneys and sheriffs. In this scenario, the state paid deputies would be managed by the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs while working together with the sheriffs. The sheriffs would provide the equipment and day-to-day operational supervision. When there is no related work, then state paid deputies would be available for contract work to assist offsetting the costs of the sheriff's cars and equipment. The pros of that are central management of state paid deputies with a focus primarily on the state's needs. There would not be any significant change in the current operations and no learning curve. The cons to that would be the need the need of the buy-in from all of the sheriffs, because the equipment, training, and operational supervision, and most importantly, the sheriff's appointment of these deputies. Another con is the sheriffs have little impact or little input into the department, which is mostly centered around state's attorneys. The department would have to employ a dedicated coordinator with the authority to manage, direct, and oversee the program and its employees. Transfer to courts, which Senator Sears and I talked about quite a bit. So that is predominantly their mission, and the pros of that would be perhaps better management of the court schedule, since the deputies are under the direct control of the courts. The cons, the courts would need to organize a system of management. There would have to be a mechanism for new employees to become sworn, trained, and managed. There would need to be an injection of money for cars and equipment. There would have to be more than just the 25 transport employees. The ability to contract with the sheriffs would be completely dependent on the sheriffs. Transfer to Agency of Human Services as an option. The pros, employees could serve corrections, Department of Children and Families, and the Department of Mental Health when not needed in court. The need by these agencies is great, and there would be savings in contracted services. Department of Corrections has experience in the management of security-related personnel. Perhaps there could be mutual aid with other AHS employees to assist with the extra people needed to transport prisoners from correctional facilities to courts. A significant pro would be the operational control of the who have the experience in security-related management issues. The cons: there would need to be a mechanism to have employees sworn, perhaps through a willing sheriff. Their equipment needs, law enforcement training, assistance with transports, and it'd have to be a fairly significant cash injection. AHS may not want the added work or responsibility and additional support needed. We'd also need additional support for court transports. There's one that I did not include, which is the assigning these state paid employees to the Department of Public Safety. That has never been well received within the Department of Public Safety, and I'll leave that at that. The Vermont sheriffs are struggling in recruiting deputies and retention of existing deputies. Nearly every sheriff's department is reporting staffing shortages. In Lamoille County, we're short 3 full-time deputies and need to hire several level 2 part-time deputies. Before the COVID emergency, we had 45 deputies, and now we have 29. People are not applying for law enforcement positions in general. A Vermont State Police report indicates that Vermont lost 91 municipal and state officers in 2020 and only graduated 51 recruits from the police academy. Situation is predicted to be worse in the foreseeable future. Wherever the state paid deputies may be governed in the future, the same dire recruiting and retention situation will exist. My testimony on this subject may or may not reflect the views of the other sheriffs. I have been as open-minded as I could by sharing what I see to be both sides of the issue. And I appreciate the committee's time and consideration. Thank you. I don't know if there's any questions.
I want to thank you for your testimony. I think it's been very, very helpful and very focused. And for the committee, our role is that we would examine the current system of transporting folks, and which would also include transports that are provided by deputy sheriffs that are paid by the state. And we also are being asked that we may make recommended changes to the existing system and identify any benefits and adverse consequences related to those recommended changes. So that is our role as our committee. We don't want to get into too much of the weeds because this is a very, very complicated issue. But that is what was in the appropriations bill in terms of our directive as a committee for that.
Yes.
Senator,
Yes,
thank you. Senator Sears?
Yeah, I want to let you know how much I appreciate your testimony, Roger, and your thorough analysis of the different options, pros, cons, etc. But given the report from the auditor's office and other questions, I'm dumbfounded that you, Lamoille County Sheriff, provided 12,000 plus hours in motels in Chittenden County. And at the same time, the Chittenden County Sheriff showed, I believe, 8,900 hours of stay at home for state paid deputies. It just seems, and you may not wish to comment on that, but hopefully Annie Noonan can, or somebody can, to explain how that could happen. And I know, and as it looks, it appears like about 1,800 hours of stay at home for the Bennington County Sheriffs. And I know that at least in Manchester, the police department was complaining about the strain on them of trying to cover the whole motels in Manchester. It's a very small department, while at the same time having to do their normal duties. So if you wish to comment, that's up to you, but I hope somebody will. It just points to me to some of the problems with this system?
I'll defer to Sheriff McLaughlin as to exactly what, his pressures were and what have you in Chittenden County. And just to say that, we received the call and that they needed the help and we did what we could do.
Maybe Annie can answer that.
Yes, sir.
So we'll, Annie, let's hold off on that one until we come up with Annie, because she may be next. I just want to make sure, see if there's any other questions of the sheriff. Any other questions? If not, Annie, why don't you come on up?
Madam Chair, we have Sheriff Anderson with us today too.
Okay, can you do both want to come up or just one?
I'd like Sheriff Anderson jump ahead of me just because I think it fills out sort of the conversation about some of the programs that they want working on.
Okay. Wow. And don't forget Senator Sears. So if you could just identify yourself for the record, would be great.
Yes, ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, for the record, Mark Anderson, Sheriff of Windham County. I'm also here in my role as the president of the Vermont Sheriff's Association. I'm going to try to do my best not to repeat what Sheriff Marcoux has already shared regarding statute or charges. The State Deputies Program has been operating since, I believe, 1969 or thereabouts, upon the closure of the county jails when we went to a regional correctional system. The pandemic changed a lot. As you saw in the auditor's report, there was a significant reduction in transports during the scope of the audit. And that is to a degree to be understood because we were telling people to stay home. The federal government implemented funds for a variety of purposes, which included the deputies staying at home and not working if they have underlying medical conditions or other things. There was a different problem that came about with COVID-19, however, which is that we had people who were being arraigned or had hearings with the judicial system electronically. And what previously was a roadblock to this, and I hope Judge Grierson, who's on, can speak to it from the judiciary's perspective, but historically a roadblock to the remote video hearings with the judiciary was, what do you do when the person's released from the correctional facility after the hearing? That was a problem. There was, just as an anecdotal story, there were 2 inmates released from the Southern State Correctional Facility during COVID. They had a hearing. They were not from Springfield. And they needed to get home, and it was in the middle of winter. And they endeavored to get home, and they arranged to steal a car together and successfully return to Rutland County.
It's all your fault.
Thanks.
It's somewhat comical, but it's also, an acknowledgement that there's been a shift in people without resources. When the state moves a person from one locale to another, there is a bit of an inherent responsibility to return them to the locale that they're actually picked up in. If we put them on a bus in Rutland County, move them to Springfield, why don't we put them on a bus and move them back? Now, recognizing this gap, the Vermont Sheriff's Association said this makes a lot of sense to help the judiciary, the Department of Corrections, who at the time was facing a significant staffing shortage. Sheriff Marcoux shared the staffing shortage within his agency. The Department of Public Safety has shared their shortage of staff. The Department of Corrections has shared their shortage of staff. This is not a unique problem. So we saw a reduction in our mandated work of providing court order transports. But the unmandated work of saying, these are people who we can reduce crime by returning them back to the jurisdiction from which they were originally brought, is actually an improvement for the locale of the correctional facilities. But it's also an improvement for this person who is interacting with the justice system and has a reason to return home. The Department of Corrections had been providing this as possible through their field service officers. The problem that they were running into is due to short staffing, sometimes they were not available. So many of the state deputies did step into roles to provide this movement, which helps speed up the efficiencies of court proceedings and the operations of correctional facilities. I'd be happy to speak in the weeds, but I don't think that's necessary at this time, unless there are any questions.
I have a question. When the deputy is used in that particular situation from a correctional facility, I'm assuming back to the county where the person originated from, is that deputy being paid through the state dollars? But because that's not a mandated requirement, that's where the issue lies.
I wouldn't say that there's really an issue with it. It's just we recognize an opportunity that we could pivot. When we saw a reduction in transports and deputies didn't have transports to provide, we were sending them out to provide general policing, having them serve subpoenas if they needed to be served. And Annie can speak to the broad spectrum of the various activities of all the state deputies. But when we identified that this was an issue, I guess to go back to describe the program, I call it the post-hearing release program. Before COVID, a person who is due to be arraigned for a criminal charge and is currently in a correctional facility, our deputies would pick them up at the correctional facility. We would bring them down to the courthouse. They would be housed in a holding cell and then brought before a judicial officer, where then they would be able to be seen, determined if they're being incarcerated or released. The difference between incarcerated and released was a walk, in case of Windham County, it's a walk from the holding cell about 30 feet down the hallway to the court clerk's office where they would sign their conditions of release. So we just made it however many miles between the courthouse and the correctional facility as that quote unquote 30-foot walk. That's really the difference of the post-hearing transport program. They remain in state custody. They were not released until they arrived at the courthouse, which their case was being heard. And so that was how we did that.
So I want clarity. So their case was heard, they were arraigned. If they were being held and were returned to the correctional facility, the sheriffs would bring them back to the facility.
Right.
If they were arraigned and released, you were not involved in that? Or you
Is this
were?
prior to COVID or during COVID?
Prior to COVID.
If they were arraigned and released, we were involved because we were in physical custody of them. These are only for people who are incarcerated as part of their or pre-arraignment.
I'm still not clear. You bring them to court,
Yes, ma'am.
from the correctional facility, they've been arrested.
Correct.
They need to be charged and arraigned.
Correct.
Okay, they were held overnight at a correctional facility. The sheriff picks them up at that correctional facility to bring them to the court.
Correct.
They are arraigned. If they are arraigned and held due to lack of bail, or there's a bail set or no bail, but they are held in an incarcerated setting, waiting for trial, the sheriffs bring them back from the courthouse to the facility.
That's correct.
Okay. The next type of scenario, they're arraigned and they're released by the court.
Correct.
To come back at a later time, but they're not reincarcerated. They are released. They can go home. How does that person get home?
They would walk out the front door of the
From
courthouse.
the courthouse?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. It's still. That's what I wanted to clarify.
Yes, ma'am. In short, we took the paradigm and made it in reverse. We're transporting on the back end instead of the front end.
Because the arraignments are occurring electronically within a facility.
Yes, ma'am.
So when that arraignment says that the person is released on conditions and due back at a certain particular time, is the court contacting the sheriff's department, or is that correctional facility contacting the sheriff's department to transport the person back to their community where the offense occurred?
Through the coordination of the Department of Corrections and the judiciary, the deputies were staged at the correctional facility at the time of the arraignments. So instead of waiting for notification and then a delay to get to the facility, they were just there in the case of Windham County at 1 o'clock. And then if anyone was released, we would take them away from the correctional facility.
So in Windham County, it's the Springfield facility, but the court's in White River.
No, ma'am, Brattleboro.
If it's a person from Brattleboro, right? If it's a person from Windsor County, then it would be the Windsor County Sheriff that would be doing
Yes,
that,
ma'am.
right? Okay. Questions? George?
Go back to the two folks that were released in Springfield and obtained their own transportation. Were they released from an incarcerative setting, or were they released by the courts through the Springfield facility?
At an arraignment.
Or at an arraignment, yeah.
My understanding, though Judge Grierson might be able to answer the specificity of this case, was that they were released from an arraignment.
From arraignment.
At the correctional
They
facility.
had apparently a video arraignment at the correctional facility. They're from Rutland. So we as a state put them on the street with no transportation or funds.
Correct.
They found a way.
I'll note that the Department of Corrections had been doing their best to try and get people back to where they are, but due to shortages.
It's not uncommon. I've heard of it more than once. Yeah. Usually they don't appropriate their transportation, but
But this is really indicative of a shift that may be occurring, not just within your department, but within the courts and within corrections, that we may be entering the world of video arraignments. And particularly as we go down the road of starting to replace our facilities, correctional facilities. That may be more ingrained within a new facility or new facilities, whatever the model may look like. So this is really going to shift that transport issue as we shift our facilities for that. And in speaking of that, the first facility, of course, that we're looking at to replace is the Chittenden Women's Facility. So if you have a female from Windham County, how does that work in your transports? Because you then have to go up to the Chittenden facility pre-COVID and bring them down to the Brattleboro port. And then if they were not released, you have to bring them back up to Chittenden and bring them back down, and the car has to come back to Brattleboro.
So, in short, our responsibility is to transport to the nearest correctional facility, understanding some of the constraints that the Department of Corrections faced with staffing. If we had the time available and the resource available, we would bring them to the Chittenden County Correctional Facility. With the post-hearing release program, because of the proximity of the Chittenden County Courthouse to public transportation, as well as with a large amount of people in the Chittenden County court system, not really needing transport outside of Chittenden County. We took advantage of the Chittenden County Sheriff's assigned state transport deputies to use them as a statewide system for the same concept. So they would work in relation with my two deputies to relay people from Chittenden County back to Windham County. And all of this is happening on the fly. I mean, we're not notified of this until maybe 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. We don't have a schedule. We are not, sometimes my deputies have to wake up at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning to have someone at court in time for their hearing. So this isn't something where a schedule can be established. This isn't something where we can develop any concrete plan, because the plan will go out the window the next day.
And what happens when you're asked to transport? I'm assuming that there's sheriff transports to our psychiatric hospitals in Berlin, and I'm sure down to the retreat.
Yes, ma'am.
And also to the Rutland. and I'm not sure about the Middlesex Secure Residential. How does that work? Just as complicated?
It's, I don't know specifically in terms of the interactions with the judiciary. If a person were, say, brought down for arraignment and then ordered to see a mental health screener and turned over to the Commissioner of Mental Health, we would, pre-COVID, we would transport that person with a team. That might be a separate team.
What if they come from the emergency room? Would they have to go? Is the sheriff involved at any point at that point? And what's their involvement at that point?
If the Commissioner of Mental Health requests our services, we can. Some people will be transported by ambulance. Some people will be transported through other means. Some individuals will ultimately have a voluntary status and they will make their own arrangements. The use for a sheriff's deputy for the transport of mental health patients is truly because it's a last resort. We have people who are violent. We have people who are an escape risk. They could be harmful. They could be intending to do harm to themselves. And we do have training with mental health patients. We have training in the use of no or limited restraints. We implement soft restraints. Basically, everything we can do to make this person not a criminal, but rather a patient that is undergoing a very horrible experience based on a mental health condition.
I'm just curious to know what the numbers are looking like now for transports. Do you
I'm gonna ask Annie to talk about that. I don't know for the entire state.
I know some of us sitting around the table have looked at this issue for many years, particularly the transports. It's very, very complicated. And I'm just wondering if the shift, particularly in corrections, if the shift to video arraignments is a plus to do that, takes more pressure off of you folks. Maybe takes more pressure off the courts. I don't know. Is it working better when the arraignments are done right there at the correctional facility through video arraignment for you folks?
As you mentioned, we are a cog in a complicated system. Because we were doing the post-hearing release program, we were effectively as involved in pre-pandemic as we were during the pandemic and today. Where we found relief was actually in working with the judiciary and Department of Corrections. Just during the pandemic, each time a prisoner or an inmate was moved from one location to the hearing room or whatever they call it in the facility, Department of Corrections needed to sanitize that space for the next person to come through. So there was a time in between for the health and safety of the inmates that nobody was being seen by the court. And what we were able to do is, instead of returning a person who's in a hearing back to their cell and then requiring a new cleaning regimen, we were able to turn them over right to our deputies and take custody of them and out the door with them. So it was able to remove cleaning time on one end of it. Cleaning time during the hearing was able to occur, which then allowed for the Department of Corrections to better allocate their staff in the facility. So did it make our job easier? 6 and 1/2 dozen the other, but it helped a lot of other people.
Questions? The sheriff? Anything else?
I would just like to reflect on the work of the auditor's office. And I think Mr. Ash is still here.
Yes, he is.
So we did meet, all 14 sheriffs met with the auditor's office. I believe it was 2 weeks ago, thereabouts, to talk about what's called the Sheriff's Uniform Accounting Manual. That was a manual that was published in 2008 to help align the efforts of or accounting practices of all 14 sheriffs. That was as part of a response to an incident that occurred in my county with a prior sheriff. So I understand it well because I had started in law enforcement at that point. The intent was that we could bring in an office worker, such as an office manager or a treasurer, who could come in and sit into any county sheriff's chair and say, okay, we can do payroll, we can pay bills, we can pay retirement. And so ultimately we look to standardize that work. The auditor's office provided updated version of that manual this year, which we just had the training on, in which they've added some new things that we can make sure that we're doing diligent work. Vermont Sheriff's Association met yesterday, so this is all very cutting edge stuff. We met yesterday to discuss some of the differences and things that we can do to be better, which include some of the recommendations from the auditor's report, such as how do we do timesheets? There are some agencies that capture this information on pen and paper, but they do capture all the information recommended. There are some agencies who capture electronically. One of the hardest things as a new sheriff, I've been doing this for 3 years. I've been with the sheriff's office for 17 now. As a new sheriff, I had nobody to teach me anything except the other sheriffs and my predecessor. There's no professional training for a chief of police or a sheriff other than what other willing people will volunteer. So to the point that the auditor's report identifies some recommendations towards increased reporting, sometimes that's because they just hadn't got the memo yet. One of the first things I laughed at, so my agency uses a set of software that tracks to the minute what my deputies have done. And when I looked at my timesheet as sheriff within the state system, all it is a quantification of the number of hours. And I laugh because I define time to the minute. And in the state system, I'm only defining the total quantity of hours. My state deputies, I have to go through and look at my timesheets. I have to look at their state timesheet. And then I have to compare it with what we call their radio log, which is any transaction they have with my dispatch we record, to determine if there's any overlap of their time. There's a duality between the state of Vermont, as I believe this committee is aware, the state of Vermont as an employer and the sheriff as an employer of the state deputies. So we are looking to incorporate the recommendations of the auditor, and we're thankful for the work that they did. We're trying to improve the work that we do. And there's a lot of energy to help the state of Vermont save money, make sure that we take care of people's rights, and we reduce crime. So that's all I have, unless there's any other questions.
Questions? Butch?
So there's 14 of you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you have buy-in from all 14 sheriffs? Because you're all independently elected, you serve your constituents. Do you have the type of buy-in that the auditor is requesting you to do some of the things that suggested that everybody do the same thing on the same time, piece of paper and those types of things? Within your organization, somebody doesn't do it, gives you a black eye. Any comment on that?
I have not had conversations with all 14 sheriffs, so I do not have that answer at this time. My general sense is that the sheriffs endeavor to do a ethical, honest job. So is there buy-in? I think so. Is there buy-in to any one system? I can't promise that.
And you're all doing it, currently all doing it either, not everybody's even doing it electronically, and you're still doing pen and pencil.
Correct.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The questions?
I have one quick question, if I could.
Yes, go ahead.
Sheriff Anderson, I'm looking at Sheriff Marcoux' table at the end of his testimony, and it shows that you've done 145 transports thus far in FY21, which is way down from its highs periods, around 800. Does that 145 include the reverse transports, or is that just?
Sheriff Marcoux, could you comment? I don't know how that information was generated.
I received that information from the state's attorneys and sheriff's department, from our person assigned to monitor our transports and timesheets and everything. And if I would say that if there was a transport sheet filled by Sheriff Anderson. And this is a guess, and maybe Annie can talk to it, but that went to their office, then that number would be included there.
Okay. Thank you, both of you.
So if there isn't any other questions of Sheriff Anderson, Annie, do you want to come up? Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Nice to see everyone behind our masks. For the record, Annie Noonan, I'm here today representing the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, and in my role as the Labor Relations and Operations Manager, I'm the person that oversees the work of our fiscal and administrative staff who pay the bills in this program. I do assist the sheriffs with reports and with personnel issues as they bring to me, and also in terms of preparing for testimony such as this. As Sheriff Marcoux noted, there are 25 state positions assigned to the department. 21 are now currently filled. Due to COVID, the judiciary, as you all know, moved to remote hearings that greatly reduced the movement of correctional residents to the courthouses. As you can see from the numbers that are in the report, just reflecting 5 offices, they were greatly, the numbers were greatly reduced. Senator Sears, I'm going to try to get to everybody's questions first, because I think that you got good information from both sheriffs. Senator Sears asked about the issue with what were people doing and how come there was so much COVID no work. I want to say that I think there was a fair amount of confusion in the early weeks about the COVID shutdown as to how and when people should be using that. I was pleased that some of the sheriffs quickly came up with proposals for utilizing their state deputies, and they communicated that to the department of those ideas. We decided that rather than having people sit home, sit in the office with nothing to do, that we would really rather help Vermont agencies and departments and local communities. So we relied upon the 2008 job description for the state transport deputies that included the term general law enforcement duties that permitted tasks when no transports were scheduled. As a point of information, all but one of the current deputies is level 3 Vermont certified, so they're fully able to engage in law enforcement activity. Some of the sheriffs use their deputies to patrol the local communities. That helped increase visibility because, of course, corrections was letting people out of the facilities to reduce the risk of COVID. We had people who were utilizing them in the motel program, as Sheriff Marcoux said. We worked with the Judiciary and Corrections and Judge Grierson for transporting people in custody back to their local towns when they had no transportation. And how that worked, actually, in answer to your question, Representative Emmons, was rather than if they were arraigned and then cited for a later date, the judge gave them the opportunity to stay in custody until they got back to their local community. So we didn't, the release order was to, so if you were brought to Springfield from Brattleboro, arraigned and cited, the judge would say, would you like a ride back to Brattleboro? If you do, you need to stay in custody. I'm going to sign the release or custody release for the Brattleboro Police Department, or some parking lot or something down there, and that's where they would be released. So that reduced the liability of the sheriff transporting them because they were still in state custody. Some of the sheriffs offered assistance to their local SIUs and some to their local restorative justice. There was a number of issues. When the sheriff would call up to the office and talk to me and say, can my state pay do X, Y, and Z? As long as it seemed to me that it was generating assistance to the local communities or to another state agency, the answer was yes, this is unusual times. We're in an emergency situation, a pandemic situation. Not normally what we would be doing. I communicated that back to the auditor's office. I talked to Doug Hoffer about that because it was always the question about the charges. The difficult thing, if you had somebody, a state transport deputy, doing something different during the day, for us, pulling people off and on payroll would have been a nightmare. So if they were helping out another agency, and let me give you an example. We had a call just recently for the Department of Labor who said, Is there any possibility you could give us some sheriff's presence at the Department of Labor building? It was the day and the week that they were, the extended unemployment benefit was ending. And they were worried about security. So I contacted the sheriff and I said, can you send 1 or 2 people over to cross the street and be there? They're worried about that. I didn't pull those people off and on. I didn't charge the Department of Labor. In some ways, the state of Vermont is one big employer, even though we all have our own separate budgets. Pulling that person, for me to figure out who was over there for 2 hours, 3 hours, was a bigger headache, and a bigger headache for the payroll division, for us, for labor. So we just said, go over and help out labor. So there was a fair amount of that kind of cooperation and collaboration with other agencies, departments. I think that made sense. I think that the conversations I had with Doug seemed to indicate that that made sense. Really, what we always worry about, is, as you've heard, are people being paid twice? I want to say today that the report from the auditor, the comment were the recommendations that I can't say that I so strongly support, that says, at a minimum, the time of hours worked, the numbers of hours worked, the detailed description of the job and the duties they were performing needs to be captured. I don't believe that can be captured on paper in any effective way, because on a regular basis, we get asked as a department for this information. And that then puts us in a position of saying, we don't have it. We don't have that data. The data is not with us. I truly believe that the transport program manager, probably saying that transport manager program that exists, that 7 of the departments use, should be used by everybody, and that should be required. In terms of the number of hours that were charged, it was significant. It gave us some concern with regard to this, but again, it comes down to this very unique, is it probably the nicest, but maybe weird relationship in terms of the department and the sheriffs, our department, the state's attorneys and the sheriff, in terms of the oversight, direction. Let me explain. So the employees are in state positions that are assigned to the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs. They're paid by the state. They have state benefits, health, dental, life. They're in the state retirement plan, and they're in the Group C retirement plan. Their hiring rate is determined by the department, but their direct supervisor is the sheriff. They receive their deputization from the sheriff, who assigns their work schedule on a daily basis, approves their leave time, evaluates performance, and can issue discipline, hopefully in consultation with the department. It's a public-private oversight. It's unique, and it's lent itself to problems. Part of the problem is it's very difficult for us as a department to basically say to the sheriffs, we will use Transport Manager. It's an electronic program, we will use it. I think we can. When the victim advocates, for example, who work with our department, 27 victim advocates, we were told by CCBS and the feds, the state timesheets are inadequate, doesn't capture enough detail. So we said to the victim advocates, you're going to fill out a second timesheet. We are required to get this information for the feds. We just told them to do it. The victim advocates did that, but they of course report directly to the state's attorney. In this situation, when we see cooperation from the state's attorneys to enforce that. In this situation, I truly believe we need the sheriffs to say we're going to go electronic. We need to capture data. We need to capture a lot more data. So the COVID directions as they came out from the state were basically you can charge for no work sent home, for a school or a business closing, for your own illness or illness in your family. There were many, many charges. My quick review indicates that there were probably about 15,000 hours charged among the departments, the 12 offices. I think only 10 charged, had any employees charging. That's a significant amount of time being charged to the COVID no work. And I can't, but for us to have I guess I would say that it would be difficult. It was difficult for us to intervene to say your people need to get out to work. We encouraged it. We approved almost every idea that came forward, but because the assignment of work is driven by the sheriff and not by central office, we had to, we could do that. We could encourage and we could approve, saying, yes, we think that's a great idea. Let's why don't you go ahead and do that. So one of the questions that came up is, would there be any legislative fix? I think there would be one. I think that one of the key problems is determining what other tasks, other than that, which are outlined in Title 24, can a state deputy do when they're on the state payroll. It would be tremendously helpful if the partners and perhaps this legislative body would look at Title 24, that section of the very short, it talks about, it's 290B, that talks about full-time deputy sheriff whose primary responsibility is transportation of prisoners and persons with mental condition or psychiatric disability shall be state paid by the state of Vermont. That's it. That's all it talks about in terms of their responsibility. It would be really good if there was a conversation about how we could better utilize the positions when they're not engaged in an actual transport of somebody from a facility to a court situation. The department supports a review with other state agencies and departments as to their transport and other needs, and whether or not the state deputies could assist. At this time, the department can't direct the sheriff to have the state deputies perform those other duties, even though the work schedule could accommodate requests for help from other state agencies and departments. Senator Hooker asked if the numbers were low, and they are coming up, but they are still low. Jury trials are slow. I know Judge Gerson's on the phone. He'll probably talk a little bit about that, but they are coming up. Things are reopening, but not in every county, as I think you are reading and know. Remote hearing situations. What I've been told by people, correctional employees, is that the prisoners like it because they don't have to sit all day waiting out of the facility, get down there, sit and wait. They can actually get pulled in when it's their time. They can be back in their room and back in their program. The prosecutors like it because it really moves the court schedule. They're able to feel that things move much quicker. Obviously, that wouldn't be necessarily a good venue per se for certain types of trials. Jury trials would be very difficult to do that way, but for lots of activities, it can be very helpful. That, don't know if I answered everybody's questions, but that would be just some comments in response to the questions I've heard the committee asking.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Annie. Teresa.
Annie, I've got a couple of questions and then a thought. So the language you described in 24 VSA 290, bless you. I think the key word there is primary, in terms of it certainly allows other things to happen as has happened. And what I wonder is it seems as though the payment and expectations are based upon function as opposed to capacity. And so this, I don't necessarily expect you to have an answer for this, but I think it's something for us to think about when we think about the state paid sheriffs, and do we contract just for a certain capacity, and that capacity needs to exist if the state's going to pay, for a certain number of positions, as opposed to necessarily identifying each and every specific function that could or should take place. Because I always think about when we start listing things, there's always things that get left out, or there's things that come up that, really, oh yeah, that would be a great use of support. So I guess I just urge us to think about how we might look at this as a capacity in each one of our counties, as opposed to, paying by each function. And the duality of supervision issue, that's as long as, as long as that system exists, I mean, there's going to be issues with it. And so I don't really have any proposal around that, but on the other thing, I think it would behoove us to think about capacity in our counties as opposed to trying to identify each function.
I think the uniqueness of this public-private ventureship is that the sheriffs do support through their other staff, the per diem staff. They are basically helping the program keep afloat. The sheriffs own the cars. They are dealing with equipping people and getting uniforms and equipment. So there's a substantial amount of support from the sheriff themselves. So when Sheriff Marcoux was talking about this, if there was a way that we could, look at that capacity so that perhaps the sheriffs felt that they were able to utilize those positions in a way that would keep their balance sheet healthier or more productive. It's very difficult because a car takes somebody from a correctional facility, goes up to court and sits. There's no mileage, it's just, a round trip mileage. That car is sitting there. Now, so that's a problem. It's out of function for that sheriff for the day because it's sitting up there. There's lots of ways in which, even the per diem rate that's set in statute, like again, one other area where a legislative fix could be used, we really could use a review of that rate. The flat rate is $22 an hour, and they have a minimal amount that they can add on to that based upon the statutory language. That hasn't been raised in years. And some of the sheriffs have said, using a per diem, they lose money. They're paying because of the difficulty with recruiting and retaining law enforcement officers, everybody's paying more money for them. So at some, Sheriff Marcoux testified $24.66 is what he's able to charge. And he's generally got a per diem who's making more than that. So he's got the car, the person he's outfitted with, and he's only he can only get the $24.66, doesn't pay for it. So the sheriffs are struggling to kind of figure out, they have to raise money in their other contracts. And some of what they're raising is supporting their state program and moving it. So that's a problem for them. The other piece of this though is, we don't want to be in a situation where, as Representative Wood said, there's capacity and we have a kid potentially sitting maybe in a local PD and we need a transport for that kid. There shouldn't be a question as to, can somebody get that kid and move that kid? We should be working together to say, who's got capacity? Go pick that kid up and get that kid out of there and bring them to the program they're supposed to go to. So those are I agree with you, those are the capacity issues. It could be mental health, it could be juveniles, people in corrections. We really do need to support and think about this as state government as one employer.
And I guess the thing when you were just describing that is always, I remember this being a bugaboo for me when I was on Representative Emmons' committee, is the differences, because we have essentially 14 different departments, even though, call ourselves one department of sheriffs, but it's implemented in 14 different ways, across the state. And, so when you were giving the example earlier about, Washington County, can you send somebody over to DOL because we think, we just, in Rutland, they might send somebody over and charge them, and here they don't, or, in that situation. So, that kind of inconsistency just is, I have to say, it drives me bananas.
So I would again say that there'll be at least the 25 positions are state positions. That sets them apart a little bit from everybody else within those.
Right.
But it's interesting, those are state positions, but they're using vehicles.
They're owned by the sheriff.
They're owned by the sheriff, and it's also, the money for that coming in is beyond the contracts of what the sheriffs are engaging in within the county. It's also the county budget pays for some of the upkeep of the sheriffs. So you're talking about your local property taxes are paying for that as well. So, and I remember back early 80s, I was on Government Operations Committee with Kola Hudson as chair, and we looked at the sheriffs issues because you have some state functions there. They're paid with, for some state dollars, but also they're providing a lot of local services that, and the sheriff's department in each county has to augment those state dollars with locally raised money one way or the other. And is that the system that we really want for our sheriffs? And we're still grappling with this 35, 40 years later. Still the same thing.
I have a quick question if I could.
Yes, go ahead. Senator.
Annie, recognizing that transports are way down, and also what hasn't been mentioned is there are different rates for different state agencies. So Department of Corrections or prisoner transport is a certain rate, mental health a certain rate, juveniles are a certain rate. Is there any move afoot to try to, any of Sheriff Marcoux's suggestions with the pros and cons that might be put forth by the Department of State's attorneys as budget recommendations?
So you're correct, Senator, that the different, for the sheriffs have contracts with other agencies. So the sheriffs have a contract with DMs. It's not everyone. I just want to say many of the sheriffs have contracts with mental health, DCF, and other state agencies at different rates. And so I think that, that is one area where, unless we were able to get to a sufficient rate to really cover the costs, I think that the sheriffs would be resistant to wanting to have one large state contract unless it really paid the true cost of what they had to put out, because they
I
are
think you
able
missed.
to make. Did I miss the point? I'm sorry, Senator.
Yeah, my point was, given that there's 25 deputies, given that there are different rates with the state, wouldn't it make sense to have those 25 deputies under the Department of Sheriffs, and as Roger pointed out, as one of his options, and then have one rate to the state, combining the rates that you have for juveniles, combining the rates you have for mental health as well as prisoner transport. One of the things that troubled me was hearing from Steve Howard, who was one of our next witnesses, that there were social workers sitting in motels with kids because DCF couldn't arrange transport for the kids down to Bennington.
Right. I do think that Sheriff Marcoux' suggestion may work. So I would, I think Roger and I shared his memo. I saw it the other day. I read it. I thought it was well thought out, and I think he's presented a couple of options that the committee could look at. But I do think perhaps the one rate might be helpful.
So this all feeds into what our charge is, that we can make some of these recommendations, and it would be up to the standing committees, which I don't know if it would be more GovOps, to really take a look at some of our recommendations.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to keep moving here because it is getting later and later, but we have Judge Grierson on, and it would be great to hear from the judge in terms of the court and any insight you can give to us from that lens. Welcome back, Judge.
Thank you. It's good to be back. For the record, Brian Grierson, Chief Superior Judge. In my role, in the role of Chief Superior Judge, I do not get involved in the contracts with the individual sheriffs. Greg Mosley, the Chief of Finance and Administration, who was not available today, or I would have had him join me. And you may want to hear from him. And I do not pretend to know all of the details of the contracts or negotiations that he goes through with the sheriffs, but I would just follow up Senator Sears's comment as well as Annie's, that I have heard him say that if there was one rate, that would, I don't like to use the term make our job easier, but as it is now, he negotiates with each individual sheriff's office, which certainly makes it difficult. And I would go back to one of the earlier witnesses. The judiciary is certainly not in a position to train or equip sheriffs and to consider having them as employees. We would not want to find ourselves in a position of competing with law enforcement. I think Sheriff Marcoux in his memo indicated the difficulty that not only the sheriffs, but municipal departments as well as state police have in recruiting individuals for work. And I certainly would not want to find the judiciary in that same position. So Madam Chair, I do not have a lot to offer on that part of the discussion or the comment relating to the auditor's report. But if you would like me to talk about the process that Sheriff Anderson was talking about, I'll be glad to do that.
Yes.
So let me just give a little history on that. As I think you all know, all of the Department of Correction facilities had video capability. This is pre-pandemic. In other words, they had the units installed in the facilities, but with the exception of Chittenden County, they were very rarely used. Before the pandemic, not long before the pandemic hit, but before, I was attempting to encourage judges and courts to take advantage of those, the availability of video proceedings. But I recognized when you start looking around the state that, for instance, the Springfield facility and St. Johnsbury are isolated in the sense they're not in the town proper, like Chittenden facility is, the Rutland facility, for instance. And so even before the pandemic hit, I had gone out, reached out to justice centers in Springfield and St. Johnsbury to say, could they be involved in a process of transporting people, not to their home. But what I found in going down and visiting the Springfield facility in St. Johnsbury is that I should have realized it, but the Department of Corrections officials said, look, people that are in our facility are detained here. They're either released when their sentence is complete and a relative friend comes and gets them, or if they're held on bail, whoever is making bail, if they make bail at the facility, they're released to that person. So on one hand, at least the way it was explained to me, that it was rare for someone to be released from the facility and just walk out of that facility. And even if they did, there's nothing there. In other words, they have to go down the hill. At least in Springfield, there is that convenience store gas station, but they're far cry from being able to get a ride away from the Springfield facility. So I had reached out to them as justice centers with the idea of they would make arrangements to go up, pick up individuals, and at least get them back to their own facility, the justice centers, where they could make arrangements with family or friends to pick the person up. But I had no more than started those discussions when the pandemic hit. And I'm sure not everyone would agree with this statement, but I think the Department of Corrections, for one, would agree that they would have been lost without the video capability. As you pointed out, I believe it was Representative Emmons, if we're building new facilities, I think we do have to include provision for video capability. The facilities that now house the video equipment certainly were not built with that in mind. And so I would not tell you that we haven't had problems because of trying to adapt that technology to those old facilities. But as the pandemic developed, and obviously all proceedings were then conducted via video in all of our courthouses, it became apparent that folks were being released in a larger volume from these facilities. I learned that when Marble Valley had to close their doors, if you will, to the detainee population, in other words, people arrested in Bennington or Rutland were no longer being detained in that facility for arraignment. They were being transported to Springfield. And my understanding was that then DOC was transporting them back to Bennington and Rutland. Somewhere along the line, I learned that Sheriff Anderson might be interested in, he shouldn't consider that a promotion either, Roger. I saw you smile. I had heard that he might be interested in a different process to address the fact that people were being released in these facilities after a video proceeding. I would say that 90% of the people who are detained are ultimately released on conditions. And so there was all of a sudden now a large volume of people who were being released from these facilities. And in talking with Sheriff Anderson, he proposed the idea of his deputies being on site at the Springfield facility to started out transporting people, if you will, detainees from the Brattleboro area back to the Wyndham Court. As Annie said, I had certainly concerns, reservations about this process, but met with her to make sure that this is something that would fall within the deputy's authority to do this. And the way that it worked out, or the way we worked it out, was this is completely voluntary. It's voluntary in both sides. If the sheriffs are available to do this, they would accommodate the release. If they weren't available, it is not as if the court could call the Wyndham sheriff and order them to come up to the Springfield facility and take someone. But if they were available, and we talked with the defense attorneys, this had to be by agreement. These people were being released from the facility on conditions of release. And we added a special condition whereby they acknowledged that this was a voluntary arrangement for them to go into temporary custody with sheriffs for transport back to their home court. There were no interim stops. But the idea was they would be left in the same position as if they had been transported to the Wyndham Courthouse, Brattleboro Courthouse, and released on conditions there. In other words, they were released at the courthouse. They didn't have to go into the courthouse. They didn't have to go in to report to the clerk or the judge there. The transport was to the courthouse where they were released. And so we're trying to replicate to the extent that we could how someone would be left at the courthouse where they were charged. So this was clearly a pilot that Sheriff Anderson and I talked about. He was willing to do it under those circumstances. We also had a transport order so that he would be protected from potential liability if something went wrong, as well as this condition of release that the defense attorney would have to obviously discuss with their client and agree that they would accept a voluntary arrangement of custody to get them back. So it started out between Springfield and Wyndham, and then word started to get out. And the next thing I knew, I had heard from, or the department had heard from the sheriff, I believe in Orleans. Then the Windsor sheriff was interested in doing the same thing. And then one of the committee members asked about the Chittenden facility, which houses obviously all of the female detainee population. Again, that was a circumstance where the Chittenden sheriff, working with, in Mark's case, Sheriff Anderson's case, returning somebody to Brattleboro, we would leave that up to the sheriffs to work out the details of that. In other words, we would not order Sheriff Anderson to come from Brattleboro to pick up this individual, nor would we order the Chittenden sheriff to transport this person back there. If the Chittenden sheriffs were available and they could work out an arrangement with Sheriff Anderson to meet partway, that's how it worked. And I understand that once Sheriff Anderson was involved, he worked out the details with the Bennington sheriff and the Rutland sheriff, so the DOC could avoid having to go back over on that side of the state from Springfield, and believe Sheriff Anderson worked out an arrangement with those sheriffs, so they met somewhere in between, and so that neither one of them had to travel across the entire trip to Springfield. It seems to have worked. It seems to have addressed an issue where individuals were being released and as a voluntary arrangement on the part of the sheriffs and the understanding of the defendants. From everything I've heard, it seems to have worked all around in terms of getting folks back to their, if we will, their home court. And that's how the process worked. That's how it came about. It recognized a need to bring people away from what are some isolated facilities and travel the distance of the state. So it seems to have worked. And I'm glad to answer any questions about that.
Well, we may have found a new way of delivering services. It might work.
We did, or at least we think we did. It seems to have worked. I have had, at least on my end, I don't know if I've heard any negative reports. I certainly have not heard any from the individual side who are being transported. I've had more than one judge scratch their head as to how this was supposed to work. But I think for the most part, it has become part of, at least part of the process in those counties where it's worked, where it's been suggested.
Thank you. Questions? Any questions? Thank you, Judge. Was
Thank
very
you.
helpful.
Thank you.
So we have two more folks. We have Steve Howard and Stephanie Barrett. I think probably Steve, and then Stephanie, are you just listening in, or?
You put me on the schedule. I thought if you had any budget questions, that was the reason I'm here.
Okay, great. So Steve, why don't you come on up?
And Madam Chair, I have to leave for another meeting if that's all right with the committee.
That's fine. Thank you,
Judge.
Judge.
Thank you. Good to see everyone.
Yes. Steve, welcome. If you could identify yourself for the record.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Steve Howard. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont State Employees Association. And I'm here in my capacity as a representative of the six transport deputies who work in the Chittenden County Sheriff's Department, who are the newest members of the VSEA. So we're sort of just emerging, or sort of getting immersed in these issues and getting a chance to talk with them about some of their concerns. And I don't have a lot to say about some of the suggestions that Sheriff Marcoux made, because I just haven't had a chance to talk to them about it. I do think that they wanted me to express some concern that in this discussion, as we come out of this, well, hopefully coming out of this COVID situation that we find ourselves in, that we not make any rash decisions. And one of the things that I really was glad to hear in Sheriff Marcoux's comments, that there wasn't any suggestion that this system be transferred to a private entity, which is a great concern for the 6 deputies in Chittenden County, and probably for the deputies across the state as well. As Annie said, these transport deputies have a great deal of training and expertise. They go through the academy. They're public employees with greater levels of accountability, and they have established relationships with 3 agencies that they work with. We only have to look at the judiciary to see what happens when you replace sheriff's deputies with private contractors. Vermont, for the last few years, has used a company called Securitas in place of deputies, I think in Windham County and in a few other counties. And from the perspective of many of the folks who work in the courthouses, it's been an unmitigated disaster. We're lucky sometimes that Securitas actually shows up to provide security in the courthouse. We don't want to move in that direction. We think that idea, and just in getting sort of ready for this testimony, I happened to look at the result of the work group that was put together in 2018 that talked about this very issue of transportation. One of the things that they pointed out in that group, it's pretty extensive. If you look at the folks who participated in that working group, it's a very extensive group of folks who are involved every day, from judiciary to agencies in the executive branch to the sheriff's departments. When folks are being transported by one of these deputies, there really is a great deal of risk involved to the public. There's a higher risk of escape. There's a higher risk of something going wrong in that transport, and there's fewer people who can respond than if you were in a facility, for instance. If something went wrong in a facility, you could get help really quickly. So you really don't want to go to a model where you don't have the kind of expertise that the transport deputies have and the training that they do have. That report was really, I think, informative, and it really did say that there was no other department that could really handle the capacity that the transport deputies handle under the current system, with over 7,000 transportation incident opportunities, the way to describe it, in normal circumstances. Obviously, the numbers with COVID are different, but you're eventually going to come out of that, and you don't want to make any decisions based on what happened during that period. You want to look at what might have happened before. And it also pointed out in that report that actually using the sheriffs is cost effective for the state. That if the Department of Corrections alone had to do the amount of transports that the sheriff's deputies do, it would cost an additional $2.1 million over what the sheriffs charge. And the conclusion of that report was that the system was working well, fair and reasonable cost for taxpayers. So we just wanted to, I think, raise some concern that in your deliberations in the charge of your committee, that however you choose to go, that one of the options we would ask you to take off the table is to privatize the work of the transport deputies, or to move the work from transport deputies to a private entity, which would be, we think, a mistake for the state. That's really all I had to offer, Madam Chair.
Great. Questions? Yes. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, so where do we go here? Any recommendations that we're formulating here while we're on this topic? One thing that we talked about was really looking at the current statute that deals with the deputy sheriffs, and maybe looking at cleaning up that definition in terms of primarily state purposes. There's also some recommendations, as Sheriff Marcoux document, which we need some time to go through and assimilate. Is there any other thoughts from folks?
Alice, Corey,
Yes.
I just want to state
Corey,
too.
welcome.
I just want to state too, I would need a lot more information before making a decision. I think I've learned a lot, but I've also had a few constituents talk to me about this. Two of those, I don't know if you guys froze. Can you guys hear me?
I've heard two of those, and then you said, can you guys hear me? Oops, we lost you.
It froze up.
Turn off your video and see if it works.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I wonder if you turned off your video, if it would help.
Yeah, I can do that. I was going to say just a few more information, a few more days probably of information from me, or at least another day. A couple of those Chittenden state deputies are my constituents, and I had breakfast with them last week and talked about their concerns. plus the new state rep out of Swanton and Sheldon is a former sheriff up here in Franklin County and has some concerns about some of the changes being talked about. So I think this is going to be a pretty complicated subject when we get into it to make real structural changes. I think there might be improvements to be made, but I think we just got to go into this cautiously.
Mhm. So any recommendations that we make, I appreciate that, Corey. Any recommendations that we make, I would think they would be very broad in its nature, not getting into real specifics, but maybe saying the statute that pertains to state deputy sheriffs needs to be updated, looked at in terms of what other services, state services they might be able to provide. That's a level I'm sort of thinking, not getting down into any real specifics, but just kind of say, these are some of the options out there and some of the proposals. And to really vet it and look at it. Corey, and then Jenny?
I was just going to say that makes sense to me.
Okay, Jenny?
Yeah, thank you. The issue around transporting folks with mental health issues is of great concern. And I know that we've established a relationship between our police departments and a person with a mental health background. So I think any broad recommendation that we make should ask all the committees of jurisdiction, health and welfare, healthcare in the House, health and welfare in the Senate, to collaborate with our judiciary committees around these recommendations. The training becomes very critical, and who does that training. So the cooperation between Department of Mental Health, as folks were saying earlier, is very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we can,
Dick had a
oh,
question.
Dick,
I don't
go
know.
ahead, Dick.
I don't know what happened to my video, but I guess you can
Well,
see
we
me.
can hear you.
You can hear me. I don't know what happened to my video. I'm gonna stop it and then start it again. Nope, I've lost my video. At any rate, you can hear me. I first of all, I never suggested, I don't know of anyone who did, that we privatize. I'm simply trying to look at the reality and looking at Sheriff Marcoux's figures of going from 6,784 transports in FY19 down to 671 thus far in fiscal year 21. Even if that's the March, we just started we've already finished FY21. So I don't know what the trends are in FY22, but it says to me that paying 25 state employees, we ought to be looking at what their duties are. And I totally agree with Ginny about the mental health, but when transport deputies, when sheriffs are called on to transport juveniles or the mentally ill, I still think the preference is other means. But if it's the sheriffs that are going to do it, we need a system. So I was at least hopeful that we would recommend that we look at the use of state paid transport deputies and expand their duties and perhaps unify under one or two sheriffs or any of the different scenarios that Sheriff Marcoux went through. I don't want to privatize them. I don't want to get rid of them, but I do think that we're not using them most effectively.
I think that there
world has
is,
changed.
right, I think that is one of the things we would be looking at, is to really look at the role of the state deputies and update their duties. The question is, we don't necessarily get into the minutia of what those duties are. And then I think there also, committee members want to have some time to go over Sheriff Marcoux's, some of his recommendations. So I'm thinking at our next meeting, which is supposed to be the 5th of November, we can really formalize our recommendations. Number one, Michelle Charles had to leave for an appointment, so we don't have her right now. But it would give like Corey some time to check with some folks. And on the 5th of November, we can be a little bit more cohesive in what we're recommending. But I think we recommend, make broad recommendations, not get into the real nitty gritty of that. And also one of the recommendations could be what Jenny said, that all the respective committees in the House and in the Senate, they need to collaborate and work together on this because we're dealing with a lot of different populations and needs of those populations. For that, Butch?
Thanks, Al. So when we tussled with this a few years back, we heard that there was a statewide rate. The rates were being, contracts were being made to various sheriffs in various counties at different rates. And I heard today that, you know, possibly we should have one statewide rate for all services that the sheriffs provide for the state. And I think that's something that whoever has it, GovOps or whomever gets this, should seriously look into. And that might solve some of our, I don't know what it's going to solve, but it'll at least give us some surety of what we're paying everybody. Right now, I'm sure it's all over the place. The second piece that I heard Annie talking about the 25 sheriffs that are actually state positions. They're really, if they're getting all the state benefits and they're getting all the state salaries and they're getting all that stuff, we should look into should those people be under state jurisdiction and not have 14 different bosses wherever they come from. And it sounds fairly complicated that I don't know if you're a reimbursement rate or what you are, Annie, but you know, if they're in the pension system, they're doing all that other things. They, you know, if they look like a state employee, they probably ought to be a state employee, maybe. But I think that's something that we really need to delve into also. Or the committees do, but we can't get in the weeds on that.
Right, but those are recommendations. So these are some of the items we need to look at and update the law. Okay, so that can be on our agenda for the November 5th to really make those decisions. Anything else on this before we get into a committee discussion to make sure November 5th for the ceiling expungement? I know that Michelle's going to work with you and Dick Sears for further work. We do have the 5th of November scheduled for our next meeting. We do have the 12th of November as a possibility. We do not have anything scheduled after that.
And the 29th from 1 to 3, the UVM report.
The 29th of October is in the afternoon. It's a Zoom meeting. It's with the child protection.
Child protection. It is in person as well. Because it's I don't know if you need to.
But we're doing, I think that we are doing.
You guys are doing the Zoom.
We're zooming in. I don't think we have to come up here for that because the child protection committee is the one that's handling it, but it needs to be reported to both committees. But let's, for our end, let's at least do it on Zoom. Would that be considered one of our committee meetings?
I have no idea.
I don't think so. For that.
You're not, if you're not, I think if you're not in person and you're, then it's not a quorum. We don't count as a quorum when we're sitting here on Zoom. We can't vote. So that's another good question. I don't know whether we're.
You're on the child, Jenny, you're on the child protection.
Yes,
committee,
yeah,
correct?
yeah. I'm chairing it this year. And so your committee, this committee being there by Zoom makes a whole lot of sense because it's a presentation by the researchers from UVM. I think it's on custody issues in the state. I think you'll find it it'll be a very good, a good meeting to attend. But I think it's a question for Ledge Council or the Rules Committee as to whether, or maybe, you know, Senate Secretary and House Clerk whether or not it counts as a committee meeting. I wouldn't think that it would, but
I wouldn't either, because child protection is meeting all day that day, aren't they?
yes, we are.
Yeah,
And what time would this be?
1 o'clock in the afternoon.
1 to 3 or?
How long would that presentation be?
I
Jenny?
think it's 1 to 3. Peggy can clarify
Correct.
that.
Correct.
It would be good to send out, Peggy, a reminder to all of us.
Yeah, I did, but I'll send you another one. No
Yeah,
problem.
because the schedule is just getting
Yeah.
crazy.
I'll send you another. I bet it's on most of your calendars already.
Yeah, and I've lost track of how many committee meetings we've had. Is this our fourth?
I can probably tell you that. Hold on.
I've totally lost track.
Two.
Fifth?
October 11th is 2. That can't be right. I'm only showing 2. But that can't.
No, we had one in June.
Oh, okay, yeah. I don't have those on this. I have to look at.
How many
Would have been previous fiscal year.
Huh?
June would have been the previous fiscal year. I don't know if your mini counts are.
We go by calendar year. We don't go fiscal.
1 second, I'll be able to.
We go more from the end of the session until December. Okay. Remember, if this is our fourth or fifth meeting.
Give me 1 second. I can find out.
So if we can do work on the ceiling expungement, who cannot attend
On the 5th?
on the 5th?
Cannot.
One thing I think we need to get, I'd like to get that behind us if we could. So while Peggy is working on that, let's just take a breath here.
June, July, August, September, and October. So this is the 5th one, but the first one was June 3rd.
So the 5th one includes June 3rd.
Correct.
Yikes.
Were we still in?
No, we weren't such June 3rd. That was last year.
Oh, you saw they run together.
I think we're entitled to 6. I don't think. Just trying to think if it would be better. One thing I'm thinking, Peggy, this is what's going through my mind. If the last one, who on the screen, the Zoom folks, cannot make the 5th of November? Are you all able to make the 5th of November? Providing someone may not be getting enough sleep at night because they have a new addition to their family. That's not gonna count, Corey.
I will be here by then. The baby comes on Monday, no matter what.
Oh, does it?
So.
Yay.
My only thing is I would have to be back in Bennington by 6. I have to get coverage.
Okay, I think.
And I'm pretty sure I can be there on the 5th.
Because we really need a quorum up here in terms to take some votes.
Yep.
We do have a backup if we can't do it on the 5th, to do it on the 12th of November. So let's shoot for the 5th.
I thought we were
Of
meeting
November.
both. I thought we were meeting both dates.
Well, our November 5th meeting is our 6th meeting. Do you think, Dick, we could meet another time,
I think
another meeting?
My
Besides our
experience
6th?
is all it takes is a letter from you and I to the
Do we
respective.
want to try to schedule another meeting?
I think,
after the
I've
5th?
already got the 12th down, so I think it wouldn't hurt to make sure.
Yeah, I have the 12th.
You want to do the 12th? I've got it down.
Yeah, I had sent out invites to everybody, so it's probably on the calendars.
I
Okay.
think just a brief letter to the speaker and the president pro tem. That's
Okay.
what we did in the past. The issues
Yeah.
are more complex this year than ever.
So we'll meet on November 5th and we'll meet on November 12th. And hopefully, and on November 5th, what I'm gonna ask Peggy to do is prior to the 5th, which is a Friday. At the beginning of that week, Peggy, if you could send out a request to each of the committee members to indicate that they can make it on the 5th.
Okay, and I'll have them respond to you, I just think it's better that
Yeah,
you deal with it.
just to make sure and to be here in person
Yes, yep, I usually do that anyway, but yep.
so that we can take a vote. You can't vote if you're on Zoom. We need a quorum in here, in the committee, in the room.
No problem.
This is a reminder to folks. Anything else that we need to discuss?
I wish we had an opportunity to say thank you to Commissioner Baker before he leaves.
I know. The 1st of
Perhaps just
November.
perhaps just
And
a
who?
And Judge
letter
Grierson.
from
Oh, Judge Pearson, yeah.
Judge Grierson.
I didn't know Jim was gonna be here. He's leaving.
Hmm.
The person I believe is on the agenda. I mean, we're gonna work them right to the end.
Okay.
But maybe if we have just a minute for both of them to join us virtually to just thank them.
Good. Would that be November 5th, you think we do
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I think
let's see if we can do
they're
that.
both leaving right around the
Judge
15th of
Grierson is
November.
definitely gonna be gone by November 1st, he told me that.
Are you
Well,
suggesting? Dick,
we
what
just
specifically
asked-
you said?
I'm suggesting that we ask them to join us virtually so that we can thank them.
Is that at our November 5th meeting?
Yeah. I think Baker's leaving the 20th something of November. He's staying around for a week or two with the new commissioner.
Let's see. Okay.
So how are we gonna do this? Because I know Jim would be around for a little bit. He'd be around on the 5th if he could do that. I'm just not sure about Judge Pearson. Maybe we could get an email out, Judge, and see if he'd just be willing to pop in.
Well, I can tell you one thing, Judge Grierson is on the agenda for child protection on the 29th, and that he's the last witness. And that's come back at 1 for a few minutes before you have your presentation. I don't know, it's a thought. I think he told me he was done definitely by November 1st, the latest, but don't quote me. That's what I think he told me.
That'd be
Do you
fine.
want to try it that way, Dick, to see?
Yeah,
on the
that's fine.
29th?
That's
Yeah.
fine. I just wish I'd remembered that before he signed off.
I know. Can you check on that, Peggy?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, that'd be great. And then we'll see if Jim Baker could join us virtually on November 5th. And it'd be great if we could just do it at the beginning of the meeting, if possible, because we tend to get tied up.
Yep.
And not get anything.
You're around for us to say thank you.
Don't schedule them at 1 o'clock, because probably had lunch. Great, we've been going. Anything else before we finish up for today and head home?